Dublin. I hope you had a great break. I know it was a quick one, but I hope you enjoyed your lunch and you're ready for another afternoon full of amazing content. I just want to say a very quick thank you for this morning. It's been an absolute pleasure to be your MC this morning. I've had an amazing time with you guys, and you've been an incredible audience, making my job much easier. So I just want to say massive thank you. And I'd like to pass it over to your MC for the rest of the day. You might recognize her face and voice from the Irish language classes videos.
You might recognize her face and voice from the classes videos.
Sorry guys, if you are not talking, would you mind muting yourself? Can you please make sure that everyone is on mute? We can hear some background noise. Okay, super. So I'd like to hand it over to Colleen Baxter, who will be your MC for the rest of the evening. And thank you so much for your time this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Colleen Baxter, and I'm the local president in JCI Galway, and it's an absolute honour to be your MC for this afternoon. I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear that this afternoon will be just as jam-packed as this morning was. To kick off, we have Kingsley Aikens joining us next to discuss the power of networking. We'll have Joe Dalton at 5:05 to discuss conscious leadership. Cormac Owen and then we'll finish off this evening with some of our wonderful social events. So we'll be doing a pub quiz, and we'll have some wonderful music as well, some quarantunes with Matt. Also, don't forget that some of the interlude questions will be used this evening for the pub quiz. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next event, The Power of Networking in a PC or Post-Corona World with Kingsley Aikens. Kingsley is a recognised expert on networking and has written and spoken extensively on the topic. He has run workshops and presentations for some of the world's leading companies, such as Google and LinkedIn, and has worked with governments and international agencies, such as the US State Department, the UN, the EU, and the World Bank. He's an economics graduate from Trinity College Dublin and has worked in 6 countries. So he's going to cover the importance of our networks as we exit gingerly from enforced isolation and begin to reconnect as societies and economies. The webinar will show you how to build strong and diverse networks, and will lay out a precise 4-step process on how to do that. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to the man of the moment.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I appreciate that introduction, which was a little bit over the top. A little bit over-exaggerated about me and my talents, but I have to admit, it was pretty much exactly the same as the one I emailed through earlier this week. So do appreciate that. And thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the honor of addressing JCI. And I know you're all over the world, so today is a kind of a bit of a grey day in Dublin, so I'm happy to be indoors. As Colleen said, my name is Kingsley Aikens. I have a company, a consulting company called the Networking Institute. But my background is I was born and educated here, and then I spent most of my life overseas. I was in France for a short time. I was in the UK. I then spent 8 years in Australia, and then 14 years in the United States, based in Boston. And what I learned going to those countries, some of those countries where I knew nobody, and I had to start from the beginning, was that networking was absolutely key. And I wouldn't have got where I was, I wouldn't have been able to survive, not only survive, but try and thrive without actually being good at and keen on the whole area of networking. So I think now, given what's going on in the world, I think networking is going to be more important than ever. Because we're going to be into a period now of, for many people, career transition, where they may not be going back to the job that they used to have, and they may actually have to think about altering not just their jobs, but perhaps even the career that they're in. So my objective is to convince people to put networking front and center of their professional life. So you could maybe put up that first slide there, Laura, that'd be great. So there's a core truth about kind of life and business is that it is all about connections. And it's a very basic human desire for interpersonal interaction. That's kind of what we all want. And we're finding it so difficult in this period of kind of enforced isolation where we're sort of somewhat in hibernation. But the reality is that without a network, your success will be capped. And you have to build a strong network by investing in it over time. You know, it can seem a bit daunting, particularly when you're starting out, is how do you get to have a strong and diverse network? And it sounds a bit like picking up grains of sand one at a time. But actually, if you do it sufficiently, it becomes bucketfuls and it really becomes quite significant. It's not about any one big thing. Networking is not about any one single thing, but it's about lots of small things, which if you do them on a regular basis, on a daily basis, they become habits and then they become rituals. They actually become the way you live your life, the sort of person that you are. And when you think about it, every day you have 5 opportunities to network. You can have a breakfast, you can have a lunch, you can have a dinner, you can have a cup of coffee during the day, you could have a beer or a glass of wine after work. 5 a day is 25 opportunities a week. And if you just took, 2 of those opportunities, that would over time mount up to be really, really quite significant. So, it is a fascinating notion that you can kind of build up this thing. And it's based on a very simple premise. Life is a game of inches. The difference between success and failure can be tiny. The difference between coming first and second can be minuscule. I used to work for the IDA, the Industrial Development Authority in Ireland. My job was to get investment back into Ireland. And when that happened, fantastic. If we won an FDI decision for Ireland. If we came second, we got nothing. So life can be quite brutal like that. So I believe you need a strong and diverse network to just survive in the world that we're in. It's a necessity, not a luxury. And there's a price to be paid for being just an average networker. And it's about 3 things. It's about changing your attitude to become relationship driven rather than transaction driven. It's about altering your behavior, and it's about learning or perfecting some skills. And they're the things that we're going to look at. But also, it is about taking action. You have to take action. And as the guy says, you can't learn to swim by reading a book. You have to sort of do something. And if nothing happens, nothing happens. So I thought I'd start off today by putting up the first poll, which is just a question. I'd love to find out from people here as to whether they think looking forward in this post-COVID world that we'll be entering into, is networking going to be more important or less important, or really will it just be the same? So I'd be really interested if you could just have a quick little response to that. And I'll continue on, but just be fascinated to know what people are thinking. I'm sort of seeing these, obviously, most everybody recognize that this is a critically important skill that we need to all have, a critically important part of creating our future. So if I could just go on to the next slide, which is we're living in this time of extraordinary disruption. This COVID-19 pandemic is causing disruption like none of us have really ever seen before in our lives. We don't know today what tomorrow will bring. The impossible became possible. The uncertain became certain. And we're living in what we call a world of VUCA, we call it in English, VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. They're the challenges that are out there. So what we're going to be facing as we exit gingerly, as I said, and our economies begin to open up, as our societies begin to open up, we are going to enter into a period of intense disruption and turbulence, but also there's going to be opportunity. And if you look back in history, some of the most awful events in history have been followed by periods of innovation, great growth, great creativity. It's the one thing human nature has, is extraordinary creativity. I'm convinced that's what's going to happen following this period. But there will be, more crises coming in our lifetime. In fact, somebody put it quite interestingly to me recently. They said, if you were born, imagine you were born in the year 1900. When you were 14 years of age, there was a world war. When you were, it killed 20 million people. When you were 18 years of age, there was a pandemic, the Spanish flu, that killed 50 million people. When you were 29 years of age, the entire world economy collapsed with the Wall Street crash of the Great Depression. When you were 39 years of age, the world entered into another violent war. In fact, in that century just passed, over 100 million people died in violence. So there will be more crises. And what we have to do is prepare ourselves, equip ourselves, and make sure that we're able to weather these crises. Now, I'm old enough to have lived through some of these things in the past, but certainly the one I remember most was working in Boston in the United States when 9/11 happened. I was running a foundation to raise money to support projects in Ireland. I went into my team the next day and I said, I don't think we will continue to exist as an organization. I think we'll probably have to close the organization because nobody in America is going to be interested in supporting projects in Ireland. And the following week, we were planning to have a dinner in Pittsburgh with the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who was my boss. His name was a guy called Dan Rooney, a wonderful man. And I rang Dan and I said, you know what? I think we're going to have to cancel this event. It won't happen. People are consumed by what's happening in America. And he said, no, we're going to have the event. But this event, we're going to raise a lot of money and we're going to give it all to the New York firemen. And so we did. We had a magnificent event, incredibly emotional evening, raised a lot of money, gave it to the firemen. So what we did was we did the same things as we always do, but we just changed it and tweaked it a little bit differently. And so we really listened to what our supporters were saying. We engaged our board and we got through this crisis. And I think that's the kind of thing that's going to happen here. We're going to have to sort of knuckle down and find a way to get through. And in this lockdown period that we're now exiting, there's an old expression in Ireland that says, when business is down, that's when you paint the shop. That's when you get ready. So now we have to get ready. But bear in mind, before this COVID-19 happened, we were in a period of extraordinary change. That was happening anyway. There was extraordinary disruption going on in the world before this COVID thing happened. Technology and globalization were wiping out whole sectors. We had extraordinary shifts. I mean, think about it. Airbnb, was the biggest accommodation company in the world, but they owned no accommodation. Uber was the biggest taxi company in the world, but they owned no taxis. Facebook was the biggest content provider on the web, but they create no content. Alibaba, the biggest retailer, but they had no stock. And the World Economic Forum was saying that this is a couple of years ago, and the year 2025, that 75 million jobs will be eliminated, but we will create 133 million jobs. So the mantras before this COVID were things like success in the past is no guarantee of success in the future. The strategies that got us here will not get us there. To stand still is to fall behind. Business as usual is not an option. We have to embrace change dramatically. As Peter Drucker, the great American management consultant, said, to create the future, you have to be the enemy of today. Or Charles Darwin, the great British anthropologist, and he wrote the Origin of the Species, and he said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, or even the most intelligent. It's those most able to handle change. So that then is the issue of how do we adapt and handle this kind of change? And there was an emergence of a kind of a new form of capitalism, if you like, before this happened, which is the network power of individuals. The vertical world of hierarchies was being replaced by a horizontal world of networks. The information age is over. Everybody can get every piece of information. They can Google it, they can get access, but now we live in the network age. And so now we're in, and I don't know if you can put up my next slide, which is entitled soft skills. But networking is a key soft skill. And soft skill is a slightly unfortunate word and name because it sounds a little bit squishy. It sounds a little bit not very important. So, but the irony of soft skills is that they're quite hard to do well. And soft skills are the personal skills that allow you to interact effectively and harmoniously with other people. It's about who you are rather than what you do. Doesn't show up in the recruitment process, this ability to have soft skills. And what do soft skills mean? It's about empathy and creativity and emotional intelligence and persuasion and collaboration. And of course, it's about networking. You know, Google did a study some years ago, and you can go on, you can Google it. And they did a study as to what makes a leader in Google. And they discovered that you need 8 characteristics to be a leader in Google. And the 8th and least important characteristic was technical ability. All the other skills were what we would call soft skills, working in teams, collaborating, listening, being a mentor, all of those soft skills. But here's what's interesting. You don't get taught this at school or college. Companies don't have strategies for it. Nobody does any courses in it. And yet these are critically important. LinkedIn, who is an extraordinary organization with 700 million people now giving their details to LinkedIn, they did a study and they found that 57% of managers said that soft skills were more important than hard skills. And just last year, I worked for a day in the National University of Singapore, which is the #1 university in Asia, number 20 in the world. Fantastic kids, brilliant kids who go to this university, and they come out and they're deductive and analytical and they're terrific, but really weak in their soft skills. And they've now set up in this university a center called the Center for Future Ready Graduates. So if you just could give me the next slide, which is about networking and career progress. So this is a really interesting concept. And this is the concept which was put together by a guy called Harvey Coleman. So Harvey Coleman, an American, he has this kind of really outrageous theory, which I think is brilliant. And what he says is that how well you do your job contributes 10% to your career progress. So surely that's crazy. Surely that's outrageous. Surely how well you do your job is what it's all about for your career. And he says, no. He said, because a strong business performance is mandatory. Everybody has to do a good job, otherwise you'd be out. You wouldn't get in the company unless you do a super job. It's just a price of entry to get into a company. He said it gets you on the ladder. It doesn't get you up the ladder. He said you get paid on performance. You get promoted on what other people think of your potential. And this introduces 2 pesky little words, which are other people. It's what other people think of what you do. Because he said, your future in your organization will be decided by people when you're not in that room making that decision. So there's a lot more to career advancement than just doing a great job. Performance gets you a ticket into the stadium of competition, is the way he put it. And but it doesn't get you any further. So if it's only 10%, what is the rest? And if you could just flick up the next slide says, 30% of your career progress comes down to image. What do people think of you? What's your reputation? And your reputation is what somebody says about you when you're not in the room. And people are very judgmental. And they have a view on you. And this very much depends on their perception of you. And the perception that they have of you depends on this issue of your image. Are you a positive sort of person? Do you bring solutions or do you bring problems? So he says this is 3 times more important than the issue of performance. Do you sound like a leader? Do you have strong vocal executive presence? Basically, how do you come across to other people? So your image is very important for the trajectory of your career. But the next slide will show you what the final slice of this pie theory is. He says that the E of the pie theory stands for exposure. So that means who knows about you? Who knows what you do? Who has seen you in action? Who's seen you perform in meetings? What does your boss think of you? What's your boss's boss think of you? And what are you known for? Are you known inside and outside the organization? What are you a kind of a go-to person for? Why would anybody go to you? And who's going to speak about you when you're not in that room, when you're not there? So, are you getting positive exposure to the right people in the organization? That becomes important. And there's 2 types of work, we often say. There's visible work and there's invisible work. Do you just do invisible work? Or do you do work that people get noticed and they talk about? So it's really important that you can over-deliver in everything that you do, and you create this reputation, and you get this exposure, and you have a life bigger than your job. So this has got real implications. I remember when I first read this theory, I thought, this is outrageous, this is crazy. But every time I do this with workshops of CEOs and companies and organizations around town here and in other countries, pretty much everybody says, no, it's about correct, pretty much correct. It's not very fair, you could argue, and that's true, but it's critically important. So I'm a fan of the concept of, in the next slide, please, of this concept, which is called, I call it me-ing. Well, it's not, I didn't come up with this, but this was a concept created by a very famous management consultant, probably long before all of you guys were around. But his name was Tom Peters. And in 1997, he wrote this kind of seminal article in the magazine called Fast Forward. And this article he entitled Me-ing. And it has a very simple premise. He said, it's your life. If you don't shape it, somebody else will, or events will. How interestingly correct that is right now. And his idea is that you are the founder, chairman, CEO, and marketing director of a company called Me Inc. And the key is that you have to take responsibility for your own career. Because, as he said, things happen, events happen, and you need to have prepared yourself for these things. And obviously, COVID-19 is a great example. But he says, you have to create your own career playbook. In other words, in this world that we're in now, what we call the escalator model of a career, where you work, join a company, get promoted, move on, get promoted, those days are over. People are going to be moving like never before. I know it from my dad. Left school at 14. He joined a company and he left that company aged 77. So he just spent a quick 63 years in one company. He had the same accountant, lawyer, bank, all sorts of, nothing changed hugely in his kind of life. But my kids now who are coming out of college, they're going to have all sorts of different jobs, all sorts of different careers. They're going to do different things throughout their life. And companies are going to change in their relationship with these people. Companies are going to become, I call it career docking stations, where people can go in, spend a bit of time, and then they're going to move on somewhere else. Millennials, as we know, don't stay very long in companies. In fact, I was listening to Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn, the co-founder of LinkedIn, the other day in an interview. And he said, one of the questions we ask people when they're being interviewed for LinkedIn, we ask them, what would you like to do next? How can we help you get your next job? So it's really a fundamental different kind of relationship. He talks in terms of being an alliance between an employer and an employee. And this whole idea of a career for life has gone. But how are you going to get your next job? So you need to have your network. You need to have built a network of diversity to get that next job. And this whole notion of me Inc. is, don't rely on your boss, or don't rely on your boss's boss for how your career goes, because they may not be around. And anyway, when you think about it, does your boss care more about your career or their own career? So you have to make sure that you're not defined by your job title, or you're not confined by your job description. And in this notion of taking control and being of me Inc., you have to ask yourself a couple of interesting questions. You have to ask yourself, what do I do that could add value to other people? What do I want to become known for? And who's going to help me navigate within an organization? So I've got a little short video. I just want you to watch this. This is by a woman called Carla Harris. She's a wonderful American lady. She's the highest Black executive in Wall Street, 30 years with Morgan Stanley. She's appointed by Barack Obama to be the head of the National Women's Business Council. She's a wonderful speaker, very successful banker, wonderfully colorful individual. She's a gospel singer. And this is a little snippet of a few minutes from a much larger speech that she gave. So perhaps you could play that now, please. So that's the great Carla Harris. And what it really segues into is that you now have to think in terms of your own personal brand. And successful people are successful brands. And everyone has a personal brand, whether you like it or not. You can't opt out. In fact, not having a personal brand is having a personal brand. So the only question is, do you want to decide what your personal brand is, or do you want somebody else to decide what it is? And when you let other people decide what your personal brand is, it's usually not the brand that you really like to have. So personal brands can be accidental, or they can be on purpose. And my suggestion is you make that on purpose. And what Carla's talking about is that you need to have people that you can interact with in your career. And she says you need 3 types of people, and she talked about 2 of them, but you need an advisor who will help you technically do your job and give you advice, obviously, and make sure that they can pass on what they know, which is important. You need the mentor that she talked about. And the mentor is somebody who talks to you. The mentor doesn't have to even be within your own organization. But then, as she says, you need the sponsor. And the sponsor is somebody who talks about you. And as she said, when you're not in that room where decisions about your future are going to be made. And every day, whether you like it or not, you're being judged. So do you want to be in the driving seat of this, or do you want to be in the passenger seat? And I think I suggest being in the driving seat. It's about finding out what is true and authentic about yourself and making sure that other people know about it. It's important what's more important for your career, what you think of yourself or what other people think of you. So, we live in a world where there's facts and there's emotion. On the left side of the brain wants a lot of analytical, deductive, logical, and reasoned kind of information. And the right side of the brain wants emotion and purpose and meaning and all those other sort of softer skills. The harsh reality of life is that, when the left side will lead to conclusion, but the right side leads to action. And we saw that in things like Brexit and the re-election of Donald Trump and all that stuff, where emotion just took over from facts. And I always like the quote when somebody says, Martin Luther King says, I have a dream. He didn't say I have a strategic plan. But if you look at the next slide, please, Laura, it is about you thinking in terms of becoming known, not famous. So you have to think about that. You don't have to become like the Kardashians, who are famous for being famous, but you do have to become known. You have to be known for something. You have to become a go-to person for something, because we live in a world where it's not what you know, it's not even who you know, it's who knows you. So Laura, can you just bang on the next slide? So it's this networking stuff, what are the problems with networking? Well, there's some really big problems. I have to be upfront about it. Most people hate it. They just don't like the whole notion of networking. It kind of conjures up images of slightly insincere, sleazy individuals late at night in a bar, flicking out business cards. It's horrible. You wake up in the morning, you find somebody's business card in the turn up of your trousers. You don't know where that sort of came from. It seems like an inelegant way of using people. It sounds a bit manipulative, a bit inauthentic, a bit slimy and sleazy. So there's got a pretty bad image problem around networking. The next point is it's not taught at school or college. People don't do courses in this stuff. Companies actually don't have strategies for it. They have strategies for lots of things, and communications and marketing, but companies don't have strategies for networking. Networking doesn't show up in the recruitment process. It's not something people can judge as to whether you're good or bad at this. It's generally not what we call a KPI, a key performance indicator. Many people say, it's not my job. I wasn't hired to network. I don't want to do it. Another problem is we often mix up networking and sociability. We think the most sociable person is, by definition, the best networker. But actually, it's often the opposite. Often, introverts, or people who consider themselves as introverted, can be better at networking than extroverts. And why is that? Because they do it with decency, authenticity, integrity. They listen, they ask questions, whereas the extrovert doesn't listen, doesn't ask questions, is always looking over your shoulder to find somebody a bit more interesting to talk to. So in fact, it's really interesting that the introverts can be better at networking than extroverts. I think another problem is sometimes we assume that you were born with this skill. It's not something that you acquire. It's just something natural you got from your mother or whatever. Whereas in fact, there is a process to it. We'll get to that process. And then a lot of people don't realize that as their career progresses, the technical skills they needed to get their job in the first instance become less important because everybody has them, and you can't compete on what everybody has. And relationships become more important. Many people fail to make that kind of transition. And also many people don't ask themselves the brutal question, and the hard, brutal question that we all have to ask ourselves is my network good enough for where I want to be post-COVID when we get out of this? Have I got a good enough network to help me achieve what I want to achieve? Now, there's a way of finding out the answer to that question, which we will get to. But many people don't realize that one introduction and one conversation can change your life. But they don't happen lying in bed. They don't happen sitting at your desk. They happen when you're in motion. They happen when you're out and about. They happen when you do things. They happen when you break your routines. That's when stuff happens. And finally, networking is incredibly important, but it's not urgent. And we all live very, very busy lives. We're always doing, urgent stuff. And so we often neglect to do what we think is important. So Laura, the next slide is about the objectives of what I'm trying to achieve today with you guys and JCI is to get you to appreciate how important it is. This is important stuff. To get you to put it front and center of your personal and your business lives. To realize that you only have to be a bit better at networking for it to be very significant, for two reasons. One is what I said earlier, life is a game of inches. And this will give you the little edge. This could be the nudge factor. If you identify people in your network who are what we call tipping agents, who would help you nudge something in your direction. And then the second reason why it's important is that most people will not make the effort. Most people will just say, this is too much effort, I'm not going to do it. So again, if you do make that effort, I think it gives you a competitive advantage. And as I said earlier, it's about changing attitudes, altering behavior, it's sticking at these things. We all know our New Year's sort of resolutions, which we decide we're going to do this, that, and the other during the year, and they never last. So you won't change anything in your life until you change something you do on a daily basis, and that's the objective with this. So the next slide is just a quick slide. What is, I should really have started with this. What is networking? Well, networking is long-term hearts and minds relationships. But here's what's interesting. Most people think networking is something you do because you want something for yourself. You're looking for a new job, you're trying to get a sale, so you're going to do some networking. I come at it at completely the opposite direction. Networking is not about getting stuff for yourself. Networking is about giving to other people. Networking is, how can I put my network at your disposal? How can I add value to you because of my network? And that's based on a very simple thing. The more you give to individuals around the world, the more it will come back to you in your network. And it's just a reciprocity dimension to this, which is really fascinating. And what I'm saying is nothing new. Everybody listening knows this, all about this. But there was one guy, and it's the next slide actually, called Dale Carnegie. And Dale Carnegie was an American back in the 1930s, and he wrote a book. And this book is called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it's a bestseller book and has been for decades. And it's in every airport bookshop in the world. And the most successful investor in the history of the world is a guy called Warren Buffett. And he said the single best investment he made in his life was to do a Dale Carnegie course. Warren Buffett has one certificate on the wall of his office, and it's the Dale Carnegie certificate. So what did Dale Carnegie say all those years ago that still applies today? Well, he said, you'll have more success in networking when you stop trying to get what you want. Somebody needs to mute their phone there. You will have more success in networking when you stop trying to get. Okay, can you put your thumbs up, Laura? Yeah. All right, great. So I was just saying that you'll have more success in networking. This is what Dale Carnegie said. When you stop trying to get what you want and start helping other people get what they want. He said the people you are talking to are 100 times more interested in themselves and their wants than in you and your problems. He said the sweetest sound that anybody ever heard was the sound of their own name. How simple is that? He said the smile on your face means more than the clothes on your back. He said to be interested is more important than being interesting. He said a really good question beats a really good comment. It doesn't matter what you say, it only matters what other people hear. And when you talk about yourself, people think you're a bore. And when you let other people talk about themselves, they think you're a great conversationalist. And then he said, people do business with people they like and trust. Nothing rocket science in all of that, and yet it's survived to this day. But the next slide, Laura, is why is this stuff, why is networking so important? Frankly, the basic reason is in the world in which we live in today, you can't go it alone. You can't be the Lone Ranger or the Marlboro Man. You have to network your way to success. There is a kind of a myth of individualism out there that's all about you against the world on your own. But actually, opportunities are attached to people. I mean, if you're looking, they don't float around on clouds. If you're looking for an opportunity, you're really looking for people. And networking is a way to do lots of practical things that'll help you in your business lives. It'll get you business, and you'll find customers, and you'll attract investors, and you'll locate suppliers, and you'll find good staff, and you'll hold on to good staff, and you'll build loyalty. All that great stuff is why it's important. But the reason I find this really fascinating is that all the research shows that people who have strong and diverse networks, that's important, the diverse piece, live longer, are stronger mentally and physically, earn more money, and are happier. And we also, I think one of the great problems of the world today is loneliness. And networking is an antidote to loneliness. And all the research shows that loneliness is more dangerous than smoking or obesity to your health. But you do have to build diversity into your network. And that's because of a concept called homophily. And homophily is a tendency we all have to hang around with people who are just like us. You know, we were born to people just like us. We go to school, we go to college, we play sport, we go on holidays, we spend our time with people just like us. We marry people just like us. We produce more people just like us. But actually, the reality of the world is that it's very diverse. So as Colleen knows, I live in a city, Dublin, which when I grew up we used to call it male, pale and stale. But now this city is extraordinarily diverse. Here's some statistics. 17% of the population of Ireland were not born in Ireland. But in Dublin, it's 25%. But of the working age population of Dublin, it's 33%. So we've got all these people coming in from all around the world to Dublin. But here's the question. Does your network reflect the diversity of the society you live in, the economy you operate in? And if you as an individual or you as a corporate don't reflect that diversity, all the research shows that you underperform. So that's an interesting challenge which faces us all in our different cities. But networking is the way to escape your silo. We're all very busy. We've got a lot of pressure. It's hard to get our heads above the parapet. And so your network is a way that you can build that kind of diversity. Frankly, your network is the way you're going to get your next job. 80% of good jobs are not advertised. Your next job will not come from an ad in a newspaper. You will get your next job through your network, through referrals. And your network's portable. You've created it, you own it. When you go, it goes with you. It's part of your own net asset, personal asset base. And here's what's interesting. And here's what's happening in the world. Companies now want to hire and wire. Companies want to hire people and wire into their network. So when you're being interviewed, they ask you certain questions. They ask you about your education. They want to know all about that. They ask you about your experience. They want to know all about that. Now they want to know something more. They want to know who you know. Because we live in a world where it's not what you know. It's not even who you know. It's who knows you. So companies now see that as an important asset. It's what Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn calls the network effect. And he calls it this concept of networking intelligence, of companies using their employees to build intelligence of the sector. He said, no matter how smart you are in this company, there's a lot more smarter people outside the company than inside. So you have to use every opportunity to connect with these people. There's a famous phrase about Hewlett-Packard, which says, if Hewlett-Packard knew what Hewlett-Packard knows, it'd be a great company. In other words, everybody has different networks and connections, and that's one of the challenges, is to bring them all together. But there is another challenge in this, and I call it stranger danger. You won't build a network of diversity unless you get comfortable talking to strangers. And what do we teach our kids? Don't talk to strangers. But statistically, our kids are at more danger from friends and family than they are from strangers. So this is an interesting challenge we have, because we've got to build our networks. So we've got to find a way that we can talk to people that we've never met before. And it's one of the great fears of life. I mean, the number one fear that people have in life is public speaking, but the number two fear people have in life is walking into a room where they know nobody. So we've got to find a way to get over this. We've got to find a way to approach people, to change our routines, that we meet people who are different from us. And that's why people go to chambers of commerce and industry dinners and conferences. I always say, you know, your name tag at a conference is a permission device to talk to strangers. And And so the objective in all of this is that you replace cold calls with hot coffees. So that's the net why it's important. And the next slide, actually, Laura, is about the characteristics of great networkers. So what do great networkers do that make them so successful at this? Well, frankly, they work hard at this. I mean, they know that this takes a lot of time and effort, so they really work hard at it. They're humble. They don't brag. They don't say, hey, Laura, I did something for you, you owe me one. So they don't keep score in that sense. It's just the way they live their life. They're confident this networking system works, even if they sometimes can't explain how it works, but they just believe in the system. They think like farmers, and a farmer plants a seed, waters, nurtures, weeds that seed, and is confident that there will be a harvest come the autumn. Plants in spring, looks after it, and knows there'll be something will happen in the autumn. Great networkers are curious people. They ask questions. Great networkers understand that there's two types of information in the world. There's formal information, and you can Google it or you can read reports, but you can't compete on what everybody knows. And there's informal information, suggestions, advice, nods, winks, tips, whatever it is. And very often that becomes the deciding piece of information. That comes from your network. So there's an important role here in terms of information. And great networkers understand the power of technology. It's incredible the way we can connect and use technology. So they're high tech, but they're also high touch. And many people get that piece wrong. And I talk to many companies who say that the next generation coming through are technologically terrific. They talk electronically to everybody, but they don't speak. They don't pick up the phone. They avoid the coffee station, the water cooler. So this notion of the difference between talking electronically and speaking interpersonally, and that's one of the challenges now, to get that balance right. You've got to be high tech, but you've got to be high touch. Great networkers understand that. They know it's about adding value to people's lives, as we talked about earlier. And great networkers do this with honesty and decency and integrity. They're fun to be with. People enjoy being around them. That's the sort of stuff that goes to make great networking. And it all segues into, Laura, the next slide, which is actually this concept of social capital. So that's what today is about. It's about building your social capital. And social capital, an American writer, Wayne Baker, described it, the resources available to you in your personal and business networks. Because there's two types of knowledge, if you think about it. There's knowledge that you have, which is your sort of human knowledge and in your knowledge that you know. And there's knowledge that you can access, and that's your social capital knowledge. So you need to have those sort of two types. And social capital is different from financial capital, which is stuff that you own, your possessions and your house or your car, your shares or money in the bank or whatever it is. That's your financial capital. And human capital is kind of what you know. But social capital is not within you. It's between you and other people. And social capital increases with use, whereas, of course, financial capital decreases in use. And I firmly believe that social capital, people who have strong social capital, would be a great differentiating element in this next decades which are coming. So that's social capital, which is important stuff. And if you want the next slide, I think it's important that you do your networking with purpose. In other words, be purposeful in how you network. Set yourself some targets. Identify and research the people that you want to get to know. And you can, through LinkedIn, find out extraordinary amount of information in advance. A lot of companies say to me, we run these social events for our staff to meet with different people, but they spend all their time in the corner talking to each other. And it's one of the challenges. You have to take these opportunities, set these targets, do this, not in a haphazard way, but in a kind of a purposeful way. And there is one skill, which is, Laura, the next slide, which is the power of attention. The number one skill in networking, above all others, is the ability to be a great listener. And if everything else today is forgotten, this is the most important slide. The thing that you can give most is the ability to be giving full and undivided attention to somebody else. It is the single greatest skill that we need, because we live in a world where nobody listens. The only reason most people listen is to prepare what they're going to say next, not to hear what you're saying. Most people think that talking is much more important, but you learn nothing when you're talking. In fact, when you're talking, you're only repeating what you already know. See, most people seem to think that listening is a sign of weakness, that listening is a sign of not being an expert. And most people tend to be narcissistic listeners. So if I said to Laura, I'm thinking of buying a car, and her response is, I bought one last week. He wanted 20,000, I gave him 10,000, it's only done 30,000 a month. She's taken my topic and she's hijacked it. I have no interest in Laura and her car, but she's taking me. And we do that, we get sidelined all the time. Most people seem to think that conversations are a form of competition. So now what we have to do is to see listening as a form of activity, to listen like an interviewer who not just listens to what you're saying, but listens to what you're going to say next, to use those words of who, what, where, when, why, and how. You know, great big thinkers monopolize listening, and small thinkers monopolize talking. So this is a learned skill. It needs energy, it needs practice. Somebody once said, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, use in that proportion. So the power of attention becomes important. The next slide, Laura, is a concept that I love. And it's just serendipity. It's just about luck. It's about chance. So I believe this is a really important thing in your life that you can shape, that you can actually make luck happen for you. Now, some people think luck is just like a bolt of lightning out of the sky, and in some cases it can be. Or I prefer to think of luck as like a gentle wind at your back. It's always there, and you can take advantage of it. So I think, put it this way, as I said earlier, serendipity doesn't happen sitting at your desk. It doesn't happen when you're lying in bed. It happens when you're in motion. It happens when you're doing stuff. So to bring luck into your life, firstly, you have to believe that you can shape it and you can make it happen. And it's basically what it means is finding things and people that you didn't set out to find, but just chance enters into your life. And the way you can make chance enter into your life is you've got to break your routines. You've got to put your talents on display so people get attracted to you. You've got to do what I said a bit earlier, be comfortable talking to strangers. You've got to be open to difference and open to doing and trying different things. You have to see luck as like a state of mind. And if you're positive about it, you can actually learn to be lucky. And if you hang around good networkers, we always say we are the average of the people we hang around with. And if you hang around good networkers, guess what you become? So I'm a huge fan of this, certainly impacted my life. I mean, one conversation I had with one person in the United States, in Australia, resulted in my moving to the United States and a whole other shift in my career. And that wouldn't have happened were it not for a piece of organized, managed serendipity. So Laura, the next slide is this issue of trust, which is so intriguing, so fascinating. I said about Dale Carnegie, he said people do business with people they like and trust. We all know that. But trust is not an event. You don't meet somebody and trust them tomorrow. Trust is doing what you say you're going to do over and over and over again. But we live in a world which is very distrustful. The great communications company, the biggest communications company in the world, is called Edelman. And they do an annual trust survey, the Edelman Trust Barometer. And that research shows that trust in the world now in 4 institutions, government, business, nonprofit, and media, is at the lowest level in recorded history. So we're living in a very distrustful world. And Deloitte and Gallup did some major research over the last few years, and they found that 85% of people globally were disengaged at work. They just really didn't care very much about their work. They just did it. So it's pretty shocking at one level that we live in a world which is distrustful and disengaged. So there's an interesting commentary and what an interesting challenge for all of us. The next slide looks at this area that we just touched on a bit earlier, which is this notion of curiosity. You know, Tim Cook, the head of Apple, said curiosity equals innovation. And yet we live in a strangely uncurious world very often. People don't ask these questions. But if you get to be good at asking these questions and you use those questions with your network, it becomes an extremely powerful tool. Einstein famously said, I have no particular skills, I'm just incredibly curious. So it is this notion of consistently asking open questions. The next slide actually is an instant concept. It's this notion that you need to build strong and you need to build weak connections. And ironically, very often, your weak connections are more important than your strong connections. And by that, the reason that's important, and there's some really interesting research in the United States that says that if you're looking for a job, your weak connections are better, more impactful, because they bridge you into other different networks of people. Whereas the strong connections we tend to have tend to be with people we know. We obviously know and like them, but they're also quite like us. So not only do we know them, we know what they think. We also know who their connections are, and we know what they think. But your weak connections leapfrogs you into all sorts of different types of people. So that's why when we're building our network, we have to put a focus on building a network of people who are not like us. And yet we cannot give them a huge amount of time. There's a wonderful Scottish anthropologist in Oxford University called Robin Dunbar. And you can Google and read, he's done TED Talks and lots of YouTube videos about Dunbar's number. So he's gone back through history to chimpanzees and mammals and Roman centurions and Red Indians and all sorts of different groups of people to prove, he said, that the maximum number of people, the maximum number of relationships you can have at any one time is 150. You can't have 800. I have a daughter with 800 friends on Facebook. I don't think she's ever met any of them. So, you know, they're not friends, but they are connections. So it's interesting that you've got to try and get that balance between a small, finite number of strong connections, but using those weak connections. The next slide, Laura, is just using conversations. The most powerful thing about conversations is an interesting research around this shows that your conversations are only 7% about the words that you use. They're 38% about the tone of voice, and they're 55% about your body language. And so that's one of the great things, and why being on, I'm a baby Zoomer now, I've been on Zoom so often, it's hard to pick up on some of these things. And I can't wait to get back into full activity where, you know, the dynamism, the chemistry, the importance of conversations is a way of putting things across and learning about other people. And then the next slide, I believe, is I'm a fan of something, I call it keeping records. And I've obviously all my life kept records of people I've met. I've built out my own network globally around the world, and I keep records about them. But I'm a believer in something else, which is always try and remember something small about everybody you meet. Some small piece of information. Could be about their family or where they're from, or their kids and the kids doing exams. We all know how that consumes a household. Or could be about their favorite holiday destination, or food, or restaurant, or author, or book, or film, or where they go, what they do at weekends. Just some small piece of information. And when you repeat that back to them at a later date, they're always very impressed, because it proves two things. It proves, firstly, you listened. We've talked about that skill of listening. And secondly, it proves that you care. You know, you have an interest in what these people are doing. So I think that's it's a really important thing, is that small little thing. It's seemingly small, but to these people, it can be very, very important. Maya Angelou, the great American author, she said, you know, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people never forget how you made them feel. And that's an important part of this notion of remembering something small about people. So Laura, the next slide is, we've done our keeping records. The next slide is that there is a process to this networking. You know, there's a 4-step process to it. And the process is, it's about research, is the first process. But I'm going to actually, Paul, could you run the second poll there? I'd just be interested to get a reaction to that just before we start this, because I think it's going to be, because I'd be interested to know in terms of networking training, you know, I'm always intrigued when I run a course with a group as to whether people have ever done any networking at school or university, or if their company has done any training, or have they never done any training in networking? Because I ask a question in every group that I'm with. I always say, on a scale of 1 to 10 in your work, in your life, how important is networking? And most people say, you know, it's a 9. And then I ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at it? And most people say, you know, I'm only kind of a 6 or a 7. I'm not really that great at it. And then I ask the final question, have you ever done a course in networking? And most people say no. So what we're looking at here is that still about half the people have voted. And it looks as if, you know, I've never done any training in networking is about 55, 60%. They've done a little bit in their company, but they've not done it at school, at university. That's kind of interesting. And I've been talking to all the universities here and in some other countries, and they're very interested in the idea of bringing in networking as a course at university, particularly at university level, because companies are saying to them that the people you're producing from these universities are terrific. And as I said about Singapore, they're technical and deductive. They're really well trained and educated, but they are weak in this area. So I think there's a kind of an interesting opportunity there. So listen, can we go back, Laura, to the 4-step process? So the first step I'm going to suggest in terms of your network is to answer that question I referred to earlier. And the question is my network good enough for me as we exit post-COVID? Is it good enough for what I want to do, where I want to go? And the only way you'll find an answer to that question is if you audit your network. And what by that I mean, you need to print off your network. You need to put it all on sheets of paper, if it's on Outlook or whatever. Look at your network, and you need to, and a few things become obvious when you do that. First is you can clean up your network. You can get rid of, in my case, I had dry cleaners in Boston, a Chinese takeaway in Sydney. I don't need those anymore. I'm long gone. So I can clean up my network. That's a good little exercise to do, clean it up. The second thing that becomes apparent when you do this exercise is that you have some gaps in your network. There's whole areas where you don't have any connections. It could be industry sectors, it could be advertising or law or aircraft leasing, or it could be people who live in certain cities or in certain places you just don't have. So now you've identified some gaps in your network, and you know now where you should spend some time to fill those gaps. So that's important. And when you audit your network, you discover something else. You discover that you had some terrific networks in the past, and you've let them slip. You've let them go. So you could probably put the first next slide in, Laura, in terms of this is a research side. So this point is a really important point. You have had some great connections in the past, and you've lost touch with these people. It's what we call your dormant connections. You had great relationship in the past. Nothing happened. You didn't have a row or a fight or dispute. It's just that you went this way, they went that way. Your careers have shifted, your lives, your personal lives have changed, and you've lost touch. But it's always very interesting to reconnect with some of these people. You could maybe say take 2 a month, 25 a year, reconnect with people that you knew in the past, because not only have they moved on and very often up, so have you. And you'd be amazed how easy it is to pick up with these people from where you left off and connect on. So everybody's got dormant connections, which is worth doing. When I was in the US, my job was to raise money for a philanthropic organization. And so we would do, in this research phase of what we were trying to achieve, we did an exercise called rating and screening. In other words, our company had we used to run events around the world. About 40,000 people would go to these events in about 50 cities around the world. And we had the information on all these people. So when we were looking to raise significant funds from these people, contributions, philanthropic contributions, we decided to do that rating and screening, which was, we gave everybody a letter, A, B, C, D, E, F, based on their capacity. How much kind of wealth have they got? Where are they on that kind of score? So Bill Gates for us was an A, enormously wealthy. And that was fantastic in terms of wealth. But we also scored everybody 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 based on their property. How interested were they in us? So now when we hit our sort button, Bill Gates was an A for wealth, but he was a 6. He had no interest in us. So it was a waste of time even trying to get to him and his organization. Forget about him. But when we hit our sort button, we had lots of people who were C2 and D3 and that kind of category. So in other words, they had a certain amount of money and they had a certain amount of interest in what we do. And so we then were able to really zero in on these categories. So what started off with 40,000 names, very quickly, we got rid of 39,000 and we zeroed in on these ones who were left. So that was an very interesting piece of research. We also discovered, and when you do this exercise, all people on your network are not the same. So you have to segment your network. And here's the 4 categories that we recommend you segment your network into. And the first category is a contact. And that's a name on your network. And for the life of you, you can't remember who they were. You must have met them at a cocktail party or on a flight or on a course or at a Chamber of Commerce dinner or something. You must have exchanged cards and that name is on your database, but it's very, very weak. Not a great kind of strength there. The second category, kind of moving up the pyramid, if you like, is a connection. And the connection is, you know them, they know you. If you call them, they'd know who you were, and vice versa. If they called you, you'd recognize who they were. You're not doing anything, but there's a degree of familiarity. So that's better. Then moving up the pyramid again is a relationship. You know each other. You're interacting with each other. Stuff is going on between you, like each other, and you trust each other. That's terrific. Good reciprocity, good interaction. That's terrific. And then at the top, under this research category, which is the number 1 thing, at the top is the research category, is a friend. So I have people I work with who are friends. I have friends who are friends, but I don't have very many at that level. And this is the top of the pyramid, because my definition of this category is somebody you could call on their cell phone on a Sunday afternoon. And I just wouldn't do that to many people. So that kind of really reduces. So now you've got some shape on what was just a huge mass of people. You've rated them, you've put them in different categories, and you can move to the second phase, Laura, which is cultivation, which is bringing people on a journey of ignorance of you, organization, to a position of passionate zealotry. And I'll tell you, the best way I put this point across about bringing people on this journey of ignorance of you to passionate zealotry is to give an example of what I did when I was in that job trying to raise money. I discovered through my research that there was a really famous American film director from Hollywood who actually spent living in Ireland. And actually his ancestral heritage was Irish. And he lived there because nobody knew him, they left him alone. And he was a sailor. And he sailed out of Royal Cork Yacht Club. I don't sail, but I have friends who sail. And I arranged to meet him for a cup of coffee one morning in the yacht club. And he turned out to be an absolute delightful person. And I met his wife and we had a lovely cup of coffee. And then I arranged to meet him in Hollywood, in his studios, in his offices. And I asked him at breakfast, I asked him for $5 million, which for breakfast is a lot of money. And that breakfast meeting was 2.5 years after I met him in the yacht club. And it was the first time I asked him for money. And I spent 2.5 years of my life, and I met him 29 times in that period. And I got to know him and his family and his dogs and his organization and his assistants. And I never stopped asking him for stuff, because asking is the most powerful marketing tool you have. So I asked him to join our board. I asked him to host events in his house. I asked him to introduce me to executives and other film companies in Hollywood. I asked him to come and visit projects we were funding. I asked him to put on a big dinner, etc. Never stopped asking him, but never asked him for money. But he knew one day the train was going to come and stop at his station. He knew I was going to ask him for money. And so I arranged a breakfast and I went to see him. He knew all of this because he was a very smart business guy. But there's one thing he didn't know. He didn't know how much I was going to ask him for. And I didn't want him to die wondering. I wanted to make sure that I would get to see him and I would have that conversation. He was never, ever going to pick up the phone and say, I'd like to give you some money. He was never going to fly to Boston to our office and say, I want to give you some money. Because you have to ask. If you want to get in life, you have to ask. And so now it's the third phase, Laura, which is solicitation, which is to actually take all of this stuff that we've done, but it comes down to this really brutal moment, quite a theatrical, quite a tense moment where you're sitting beside somebody and nothing will happen unless you solicit, unless you ask for the business, which I always did using the same sentence, the same phrase, the same verb. I always said, in this case, let's say Joe and Patty, his wife was there, all big decisions are joint decisions. I'd like you to consider, soft verb, a gift of 1 million a year for 5 years. So I didn't ask for 5 million, I asked for 1 million a year for 5 years. And then silence. The next person to speak loses the sale. Every sinew of my body wanted to say, sure, if you can't do it this year, next year would be grand, which would have destroyed 2.5 years of work, because they would have run down that rabbit hole and said, yeah, come back and see us next year. So it was awkward and difficult and tense, but we wouldn't speak. Now, what happened was interesting. They said, wow, that's a bit north of what we had in mind. In other words, they had a number in mind, but we came in a bit too high. Ironically, the worst answer we could have got was if they said, yeah, sure, we could do that, because then we would have asked for too little. So this is a difficult moment. And again, we said nothing. And then his wife chirped up and said, you know, we did do 10 million for the LA Cathedral. We knew that in our research, which helped us come up with our number. In which case we said, look, this is huge. This is huge for us. It's huge for you. You need to think about it. You need to talk to your family. You know, talk to your accountants and lawyers and things like that. I'm going to be back in 3 weeks and I'd like to come back and have a further discussion. And so they amicably agreed to that, and everybody was relieved, and we went our separate ways. I didn't have to go back. His office called our office and said, Mr. would like to make a gift of stock, which in America is very tax effective. And we sold the stock, and it wasn't 5 million, it was 3.2 million. And it was all in one lump sum, which was great. But it was an example of a successful solicitation following a long period of cultivation, which came from the research that we did. And it left us on to our fourth slide there, Laura, which is stewardship. So this is an interesting piece. This is a very interesting thing in terms of relationships and working and doing business with your network. And stewardship is like after sales service. It's like after somebody's committed to you, how do you handle them? Because in business, the number one reason somebody gives up doing business with another organization is that they detect a spirit of indifference. Somehow or other, we took their business for granted. We don't, frankly, make enough fuss in this stewardship period. And so we had a written down stewardship strategy. We thanked everybody 5 ways. And in this case, with this guy, He would have got a thank you from me, from my boss. He would have got a certificate from our tax office for their tax deduction. And he would have had two of our directors, other directors, who would have known him over the years, called him to thank him. So we had a 5-way thank you strategy. And we always were looking for ways to reward and recognize people when they'd been with us a certain number of years, or their contribution at certain targets. So we were always looking for these landmarks. Our computers could spit out all sorts of information. And that was it. That was the 4-step process that we applied to everything we did. And I've always applied in life to all the things I do within my networking. So look, we're beginning to wrap up here because I'm conscious of time and you've been very, very patient to listen so far. Can I just throw up the next slide here, because it's an important one, Laura, which is that to think about this in every relationship with everybody, think of 3 really simple questions to ask these people. And Laura, the first question is, you just put it up there. How can I help you? In other words, it's not how can you help me? It's how can I help you? How can I put my network at your disposal? How can I give you something? So this is a kind of changing way around of what many people think. The second question then is, if you were me, in other words, what you're doing here is you're asking for advice, suggestions. You're paying respect and deference to wisdom, to experience, maybe to age even, but you're being respectful. And of course, as soon as you say this, if you were me, what would you do? You have to listen. So you're practicing the number 1 skill in networking, which is the ability to listen. And both these questions, Laura, go to the third question. The third question to remember in every networking relationship you have is to say, who do you know who lives in Reykjavik? Who do you know who works in aircraft leasing? Who do you know who owns a pub? You know, whatever it is. So now what you're saying is, are you willing to put your network on the line for me? Are you willing to put your reputation on the line for me? And that will depend on the relationship you have with this person. You can't go up to a stranger and say, I want you to, introduce me to somebody. And this goes back to Carla Harris, who talked about it. People will not put their name and their reputation on the line unless you have already won their respect. So this becomes a really fantastic question, so that you always, as I said, can replace cold calls with hot coffee, so that it is about the power of referrals. New York Times wrote an article recently that said 65% of jobs are filled through referrals. And LinkedIn, who I've mentioned a few times, they've done research that shows that anybody who's going for a job in LinkedIn, who is referred by somebody who works in LinkedIn, is 9 times more likely to get the job. Back to the power of the importance of your network. So let's wrap up shortly. And Lara, could you just put up the next slide and then the next one again? So the takeaways, and we'll kind of, the takeaways aren't there, but I'm going to give you the takeaways, in that you have to sort of remember all the sort of simple things that I talked about there. The importance of the importance of serendipity, the power of weak connections. Listening is so important. It's this concept of social capital. So there's all those 10 different takeaways. If you put up the final slide, Lara, if anybody is interested on getting, I have a load of publications. I can send stuff and it's free, 50 networking tips, which I put a tip up on LinkedIn every day over the last 50 days, put them all together. Very happy to send them to anybody. Anybody's got any questions, just get on to me on either LinkedIn or on my email address, Kingsley at the Networking Institute. As I said, lots of other materials and stuff out there. Could you maybe throw up, we might go back to that slide, but throw up the last poll, Lara, and just I'd be interested having everybody's kind of heard what everybody has heard. I just would be interested to say, not that one, the third, there's another one, which is what they would have learned. Do you have that one? Mm-hmm. Great, that's it. I've listened. So that the essence of what would you think of doing? Would you do all of these things? Would you really focus on that exercise of auditing the network? Would you look at building the weak connections? Would you take on board what Carla Harris said, to progress in your career, you need to have a mentor and you need to have a sponsor? They're just some of the things. So it sounds like all of the above is probably romping home as the winner of this one. And as I said, I've got material available on all these topics that I can send to people if they want to email me. So I think I'm done with Colleen. Did you want to organize some Q&A, because we still got about I still got a bit of time left, about half an hour left.
Just give me a second. Yep.
There we go. Sorry, it was taking a moment to let me unmute myself.
Yeah.
Firstly, thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful presentation. I know myself, I took a lot from it. I particularly enjoyed the piece about Me Inc. and how we're the CEO of ourselves and we need to adapt, and that's true now more than ever. And just to note, there was a very positive response to both your video from Carla Harris and also the reference to the book from Dale Carnegie on how to win friends and influence people. So I'm just going to see if anyone has any questions before I go any further. I know we've had one or two looking for your email address as it happens.
Yeah.
And a lot of thank yous. A lot of thank yous popping up in front of my screen, which is always great. I'm hoping that everyone who attended going forward, that they're going to use the four-step process and they'll replace cold calls with hot coffees. I can see myself using that phrase in the future as it happens. I'm not sure, you'll have to patent it.
I'll have to patent it, yeah. For every one of those, I expect a cappuccino.
I like it. There's some comments about the 2 ears and 1 mouth, so listening and the importance of listening. Well, let me see what we have. So we have a question going, can you tell from how business cards are accepted or exchanged whether you've been accepted as a contact? I'm not sure, is that in relation to LinkedIn, if the person wants to expand on it?
Sorry, I didn't quite pick up the question, Colleen. Did you say, how can you judge when you get a card from somebody? Is that what you're saying?
I think that's what the question is about now, maybe in reference to LinkedIn. So if they want to, but even from your own experience, when you're at the likes of a chamber dinner and you exchange cards, what's your opinion of that? Is it worth the while handing over the card, or are you better off calling them the following day?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be quite generous with cards. If somebody gives me a card, I'll swap my card. Happy to do that. Everything really depends. A bit like golf. Everything depends on the follow through. I think that it's very easy to pick up a huge array of cards, and it's very easy to connect with a lot of people on LinkedIn, and it becomes an electronic cocktail party. And that's fine, in terms of getting your own name and brand, etc. out there, that's fine. But they're not really strong bonded connections. That'll only come through time. That'll only come when you make a decision to follow through and connect with people. So I tend to get a lot of people contact with me, and very often they're looking for one of two things. They're looking for advice, or they're looking for connections, and they're generally trying to sell me something. So I have a kind of a couple of barrier devices I have when people are getting onto me. I ask people to write to me and tell me what they want, and and straight away a whole load of people don't bother. You got them out of the way. And then if I think, and if they write to me and send me something which is of interest, I use the 5-minute rule, which is I say, look, I think I'll be happy to have a call with you for 5 minutes. And I don't say that 5 minutes, but I say, I'm happy to have a call with you, and I'll suss out what what they're trying to find out. And only then will I engage them with more substantively. So there's a few little hurdles if you find that yourself swamped by people chasing you, because generally people are looking for something. And your time is limited, and we can't handle, as I said earlier, we can't handle 800 close buddies. We've only a finite amount of time. So we have to be a little bit choosy in how we handle this.
Very good. And I do agree. I know some people who collect business cards at events, like their Pokemon cards and such. And to get it is all they want to do, but the follow through is pointless, and they gather dust in a desk, never to be seen again until you meet them at the next event and you do it all over again.
Yeah.
We've a question about how do you approach someone? So do you have a one-liner as such when you're going to a networking event and you want to speak to someone you don't know? Is it as simple as, hi, how are you? Or do you have any patented phrases that we can borrow?
No, but I would say people ask me that question a lot, and I would say the following is that, when you go to a social event, probably the most typical question people say is, what do you do? So there's a couple of things which I think are interesting in how you respond to a question like that. You can say, for example, I'm a tax advisor with Deloitte. Okay, that's fine. Or you could say, I help people reduce their taxes. So what happens then is you're encouraging a follow-up question. When you have that kind of just statement of fact, it doesn't really lead to anything. But if you make yourself sound a little bit more interesting in what you do, in terms of what it might impact on that other person, it then tends to result in a follow-up question. And you've gotten over that first thing, and you've got something to offer, and you begin to have a conversation. I think there's lots of different dynamics going on in social events. How do you break into a group? How do you get away from a group? In the old days, we used to shake hands. I don't think we do that anymore, but to me, a handshake was a very important thing. And I can't stand weak handshakes. Looking people, somebody straight in the eye, etc. What's the best place at an event to have a conversation, to meet with people who are not in a ready group? But actually, that tends to be quite close to where they're serving drink, when it's at a bar side. So people are moving away, turning away, and you can catch somebody there. But I do think it is about pushing yourself slightly outside your comfort zone and being forward a little bit, but within the confines. Most people are there to meet with people. So most people are very wide open and friendly to these sort of social events, because that's why we do these things.
Very true. And I do think, unfortunately, the days of handshaking are gone for the moment, which, if for the likes of yourself, when you don't like a weak handshake, maybe that's a good thing. And it does stop the awkward hug with strangers. We've one quite interesting question, and it mightn't be one you could answer straight away, but it's, how soon in a relationship should you ask for cash donations? And I think it probably goes back to our original question on the follow through and the relationship. But do you have anything else you wanted to add that might help?
How soon in a relationship can you ask for cash donations? Is that the question? Yeah, look, it's a great question. So I told the story of spending 2.5 years, 29 moved before I could ask this particular person for a gift. But that was a big gift. It was a major gift. It took a long period of time, and it was a long period of cultivation. I did hundreds and hundreds of asks, and I used to run events, and I might be trying to get somebody to buy a table for $5,000. I would just go straight out and ask them. But basically, the bigger the gift, the bigger the contribution, the longer the time, the bigger the commitment. These things are like a dance. They take a long period of time, because you've got to build a relationship, you've got to build trust. Whereas the more smaller little gifts are spontaneous and people can make a decision quickly. So I think very much depends on the quantum we're talking about here.
Wonderful. And I do think your answers so far have tied into some of the additional questions. So just for anybody, don't take offense if your exact question isn't asked. I'm going to amalgamate a few of them because they're popping up quite rapidly on my screen. We've one about networking across cultures. So what's your experience with networks in different cultures?
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. I don't have a lot of experience of, say, in China or Japan or those countries where I think it's different. Although you have this concept in China of guangxi, which is networking. Which is a hugely important part of how they do business. People do business with people they know and respect and trust, etc. So most of my working world has been the Anglo-Saxon and American, kind of Australia, UK, um, and US. And I don't think there's really I don't think there's massive fundamental differences there. I think no, I think honestly it is about chemistry between individual people. It can work some places and not work other places, and it's not to do with necessarily cultures or countries. It's just to do with people.
Wonderful. And on, let me see now. I've had one or two come in about networking in our current situation. So how, if you have any advice on how best to network when you mightn't be able to meet them at a gala dinner, or it might be that more difficult to meet them in person.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll just explain what happened to our company. So we give presentations and workshops on networking and speaking and presenting and diaspora, a few areas. And we had about 50,000 euros worth of business, which disappeared, in 24 hours. It just disappeared. And we had great clients, great companies, and everything went to zero. So we had to do, overnight, basically a pivot, as everybody does in a good business school expression. So we pivoted to online. And the first thing I did, I answered the crisis in two ways. One is low tech, one is high tech. In low tech, I sent an email to went through my database and I picked out 500 people. And I sent an email and said, this is what we're doing. Just remind you what services we offer. And I'm not looking for anything. I just want to tell you what we're doing. And 400 people didn't reply. But 100 people replied. And of the 100 people who replied and said thank you, and I got a relationship going with about 12. And of the 12, 4 people actually we ended up doing some business together online. So it was pretty poor return, 4 out of 500. I then identified the top 25 people, and I made sure I picked up the phone. I picked up the phone every day to 2 or 3 people. Again, I said, I'm just checking in with you to see that you're okay. I'm not looking for anything. I sent stuff by post, which is an old-fashioned thing to do. Articles, clippings from the newspaper with a handwritten note to a certain number of people. So what I was trying to do was a lot of low-tech stuff. And then I decided to do something I hadn't done a lot of over the years, which is to develop an online presence on LinkedIn. I put out a tip every day for 50 days. At the end, there's about 2,000 people who were reviewing it. I write articles now. I film stuff. I put clips up. I'm just trying to now use this period to develop an extensive online presence. My hope is that at the end of this crisis, that we'll have actually moved on quicker and more substantially than if this crisis hadn't happened, and we would possibly be in a better place. I've done 45 webinars so far, all around the world, on this topic of networking and a couple of other topics. And every time I do a webinar, somebody comes back with a suggestion or a request, etc. So, I mean, like everybody, it's hard, but I think in the long term, it's going to work for us. And so what is, and for many people, a terrible crisis actually may work out to our advantage.
So there definitely have been silver linings. And a lot of people have commented that they've used this opportunity to engage with their customers more, by reaching out to them over phone, letter, direct emails, but on a more personal basis. So it is great to see that there is a silver lining around it as such.
Yes.
Let me see, do we have anyone else? Because I'm conscious I may have skipped over one or two, so apologies. There's one, is there a way to bring up your network, be it at an interview or elsewhere? So the question directly is, if you're not asked about your network, what's the best way to bring it up?
Well, I think you can do it in a subtle way about talking about what you believe in, and what you believe in is that people do business with people they like and trust, and the only way, so you've got to develop and generate a strong and diverse group of people that you know, and without, you don't want to be bragging about, oh, I know this person, I know that person, but at the same time, I think you can indicate to the interviewer that all through your life, this was an important part of how you led your life and did your business, was to build diversity in your network. And you don't have to make it a big hoo-ha, big song and dance about it, but you can sort of allude to it without bragging. But I think it's an important thing. And I mentioned earlier about this notion of hire and wire. Companies are really intrigued by getting people into their organization who have these diverse networks. And if you were to read a book, I'd recommend Reid Hoffman has a book called it's called Alliance, and he says the relationship now between employees and employers is going to be an alliance where they both sort of help each other. Employees now want to know from companies, what are you going to do to help my career? How are you going to help me progress? How are you going to train me? How are you going to turn me into a better person? As opposed to joining an organization and like my dad did and been there for 63 years. That's all gone.
No, and the relationship between employer and employee has always been extremely important. And now more so than ever, as you said, it's an alliance rather than the original relationship that they used to have. There's a debate going on currently at the moment in the chat about male networking versus female networking. So I'm not sure if you want to comment on it or maybe shy away from it. I'll give you the option of either.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, firstly, until this crisis happened, the big challenge for companies was how to attract and retain staff. I mean, that was we had nearly zero unemployment in Ireland. I mean, just finding people was the challenge, and that's one of the reasons why so many people were coming in from overseas. They were being attracted in because Google have 10,000 people in Dublin, 8,500 of them are not Irish. They're from all over the world, and it's fantastic. They've improved the city enormously. It's been great. But you asked that question there: is it different for women and for men? And I think it is. And let me say something which I've no evidence to support it. I just have a gut feeling, and it's a little contentious, so people may have some views on it. I think men can be better at networking than women, and women are better than men at friendship. And what I mean by that, I've noticed how men tend to have a wide array of kind of weak connections. They even hang around with people they don't like. With women tend to have a smaller bonded relationship, which is really, really great and intense. But there is a challenge here because the research seems to show that when men go for a job, for a promotion, and they're like 60% qualified for that job, they'll say, I'm the man. Whereas women who might be 80% or 90% qualified say, I don't think I should go for that position. So that's well documented. Sheryl Sandberg's written about what she calls the tiara effect. And that's what she says. A lot of women join companies and they decide, I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to do a super job. I'm going to do a terrific job. I'm going to focus on my work. And I will, by definition, I will soar in this organization. And then it doesn't happen like that. And they wonder why. And I think that's an interesting issue. You know, the parental advice that I would have got leaving college about my first job would have been work hard, keep your head down, and keep out of trouble. Really shitty advice, you know, not good career advice. You know, that's not in your best interest. And I think that sometimes can be a challenge for people to get their heads around, that actually, frankly, it's not fair very often. But as you move up, the atmosphere comes quite rare, and there's only so many positions, and it is quite competitive. And that's the whole pie theory from Harvey Coleman and the Carla Harris approach, that you need a sponsor, you need somebody who's going to talk about you. And very often people don't develop those relationships and then wonder why they don't progress.
Thank you. And I do think it's definitely a subject we could debate endlessly for a few hours. But just to remind those of the video earlier, so it was Carla Harris. If you do want to watch more into it and hear about her subject and sponsors, etc. And then the book was How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, if I'm right.
Correct.
So I think our questions have calmed slightly. There seems to be networking going on in the chat box, which is great to see on an online forum. So I'll take this opportunity to thank you so much for your time, for your tips, for your patented comments. And I'm sure everyone would agree with me in saying that this has been an absolutely wonderful session. And going forward, we'll definitely.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate the honor.
Say that again?
Sorry, I very much appreciate the opportunity. And please, I love building my own network. I see people from all over the world. I'm going to be traveling a lot when we get back on the planes. And anybody interested in this sort of work, I'd love to chat to them.
Wonderful. Well, thankfully, with the likes of social media, we can all connect. So do reach out on LinkedIn, etc. Everyone here to one another. So I know you've all been very well behaved for the guts of the last 2 hours. So we are going to take a quick break and do a little bit of yoga and stretching. And then we'll be back in roughly 10-15 minutes or so to see Joe Dalton. So again, thank you so much from all the JCI team, and we'll get started with some stretching soon.
Okay.
Well needed on a slightly damp afternoon.
Thank you so much, Kingsley. I'll move on next to the next thing in our schedule. Just give me a second. Kingsley, if you want to stay on, you're more than welcome to see our next speaker.
Yeah, I'm going to go for a swim.
Very good.
It'll be freezing cold, but at least I'll clear my head.
Very good.
Good luck, everybody. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Beautiful. And because everybody is taking the shape of a chair, let's do some yoga and stretch a little bit with Mark Kelly.
Hey guys, welcome along to the next in the mini Yoga Bite series, this year's online European conference with the JCI. Hope you've had a great session there. For our next in the series, we're going to do a few series of